I've always considered myself a practical man. My father built this house with his own hands, and when he passed it on to me, I swore to keep it just as he had, a sanctuary of independence. The bridge leading to the property wasn't just a structure. It was a testament to his craftsmanship and our family's legacy. I never imagined it would become the battleground for a fight I never sought. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an official-looking envelope slipped into my mailbox. It bore the familiar insignia of the Homeowner Association, and I sighed before even opening it. Ever since Karen Reed had been elected president, the association had turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. With her signature, smug smile, and iron grip, Karen ruled our neighborhood like a queen lording over her fiefdom. The letter was a notice of inspection. According to it, the bridge, my bridge, had been deemed a safety hazard and was scheduled for demolition within the week. My heart raced as I read it again, and then a third time. There had been no prior inspections, no complaints, no warnings. This was an ambush. I immediately called the association's office, demanding to speak with Karen. Her assistant informed me, in an overly sweet tone, that the decision had been made unanimously at the last board meeting. Conveniently, I hadn't been informed of this meeting, despite being a homeowner and supposedly having a say in such decisions. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of heavy machinery. My stomach dropped. I threw on a jacket and rushed outside to see a yellow bulldozer rumbling down the road toward my property. Behind it was Karen, perched in her car like a general leading her troops. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted, stepping in front of the bulldozer. The driver stopped, looking uncertain. Karen emerged from her car, clipboard in hand, her expression as smug as ever. "Mr. Drake," she said, her tone dripping with feigned concern, "we've already notified you. The bridge is a public safety hazard. We're doing this for the good of the community." "You didn't notify me of anything," I shot back. "This is my property. You have no right to touch it." Karen's smile tightened. "As per the Homeowner Association's bylaws, any structure deemed hazardous can be removed at the association's discretion. You're welcome to take it up with the board, but the decision has been made." I turned to the driver. "If you so much as put a scratch on that bridge, I'll have you charged with trespassing." "Don't listen to him," Karen snapped. "We have the authority here." The driver hesitated, but Karen's icy glare made him rev the engine. Fueled by a mix of anger and desperation, I stepped directly in front of the bulldozer, holding up my hands. "Stop!" I bellowed. "You'll have to go through me first." The crowd murmured, their unease palpable. Karen's face flushed with frustration. "Mr. Drake, this is ridiculous. You're obstructing an authorized operation. I'll have no choice but to involve the authorities." "Go ahead," I spat. "Call them. I'd love to see how you explain this violation of my property rights." Karen's lips thinned, and for a moment I thought she might back down. But instead, she pulled out her phone and made the call. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers arrived, their lights flashing. Officers stepped out, looking between me, Karen, and the bulldozer. "What seems to be the problem here, Matina?" one of them asked. Karen was quick to respond. "This man is obstructing a lawful operation. The bridge is a danger to the community, and we're here to remove it." "That's a lie," I countered, thrusting the notice toward the officer. "There's no evidence to support their claim. This is my property, and they have no right to demolish anything without my consent." The officer examined the paper, then glanced at Karen. "Do you have documentation to support your claim?" Karen handed over a folder with suspiciously pristine reports. "Our inspector found significant structural damage. It's all here." I clenched my fists as the officer skimmed the documents. They looked official, but something felt off. "This needs to be settled through proper legal channels," the officer finally said. "Until then, no one's touching the bridge." Karen's face darkened, but she nodded stiffly. "Very well, but this isn't over." As the machinery rumbled away and the crowd dispersed, I felt a brief wave of relief. But I knew this was just the beginning. Karen wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted, and I was determined to make sure she didn't. In the days following the confrontation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. Karen's aggression wasn't just about the bridge. There had to be a bigger agenda behind her sudden zeal to demolish it. I decided to investigate. My first move was to examine the evidence Karen had presented. With the help of an old friend, James, who worked as a structural engineer, we scrutinized the report. It was clear from the language and vague details that the inspection had been nothing more than a formality. James confirmed my suspicions. The bridge was structurally sound. "These findings are bogus, Mike," James said, tossing the report onto my kitchen table. "Whoever wrote this either doesn't know what they're doing or was paid to fabricate it." That revelation lit a fire in me. If Karen and the homeowner association were willing to lie to justify their actions, what else were they hiding? The next morning, I drove to the homeowner association's office. It was a modest building tucked into a corner of the neighborhood, its exterior deceptively quaint. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a forced smile. "Mr. Drake, how can I assist you today?" "I'd like to see the minutes from the last board meeting," I said. "The one where my bridge was discussed." The receptionist's smile faltered. "I'm afraid those records aren't available to homeowners. You'll need to submit a formal request." "I've already submitted 2 requests," I replied, my voice rising. "I haven't received a single response." Karen's voice rang out from behind me. "Mr. Drake, is there a problem?" I turned to see her standing in the doorway, clipboard in hand, her expression carefully neutral. The sight of her made my blood boil. "Yes, Karen, there is a problem," I said, stepping closer. "I want to know why my bridge was really targeted, and what's in those meeting minutes you're so determined to keep hidden." Karen's lips curved into a thin smile. "The board's decisions are transparent, Mr. Drake. If you're unhappy, you're welcome to attend the next meeting and voice your concerns." "Funny how I wasn't informed about the last one," I shot back. "Almost like you didn't want me there." "That's not true," she said, her voice icy. "Notices were sent out to all homeowners." "Except me," I countered. "What are you hiding, Karen?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you continue to make baseless accusations, Mr. Drake, you'll leave me no choice but to file a formal complaint against you for harassment." The threat hung in the air between us, but I refused to back down. "Do what you have to. I'll see you at the next meeting." That evening, I dug deeper into Karen's past. With the help of James and a few hours of online sleuthing, we uncovered a trail of questionable dealings. Karen had been involved in several lawsuits during her tenure as a property manager in another state. Allegations ranged from embezzlement to fraud, though nothing had ever been proven. "This woman has a history," James said, scrolling through a news article on his laptop. "No wonder she's so good at covering her tracks." The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Karen's endgame wasn't just about the bridge. It was about control. She was consolidating power, likely for financial gain. The bridge was simply the first domino in a chain of events she was orchestrating. At the next homeowner association meeting, I arrived early and took a seat near the front. The room quickly filled with neighbors, many of whom threw me curious or wary glances. Karen called the meeting to order, her polished demeanor firmly in place. "Before we begin," I said, standing up, "I have a question about the so-called safety inspection on my bridge." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Mr. Drake, this isn't the time for personal grievances. We have a full agenda to cover." "This isn't a grievance," I said, holding up a copy of the inspection report. "This is a lie, and I have evidence to prove it." The room buzzed with whispers as I laid out my case. I showed James's analysis of the report, highlighting its inconsistencies. I presented copies of the lawsuits Karen had been involved in, questioning her integrity as a leader. Karen's composure began to crack. "This is an outrageous attack on my character," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Mr. Drake, you have no right to bring up unrelated matters in this forum." "It's entirely related," I countered. "This is about transparency and accountability. If you're willing to fabricate evidence to demolish a bridge, what else are you capable of?" The tension in the room was palpable. Some neighbors murmured in agreement, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. Karen's allies on the board tried to steer the conversation back to the agenda, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. As the meeting adjourned, Karen shot me a venomous glare. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Mr. Drake." I smiled grimly. "You started this war, Karen. I'm just making sure you don't win it." The morning after the homeowner association meeting, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly. Groggily, I picked it up and was greeted by a stream of messages from neighbors. Some were supportive, others neutral, but a handful were downright hostile. "How dare you accuse Karen of fraud?" One message read, "She's done more for this neighborhood than anyone else." Another warned, "You'd better watch yourself, Mike. Karen doesn't take kindly to enemies." The flood of messages confirmed what I already suspected. Karen wasn't going to let my accusations slide. I had embarrassed her in front of the homeowner association, and now she was retaliating. The first strike came that afternoon. I was repairing a fence on my property when a man in a suit approached. He introduced himself as Carl Hayes, an attorney representing the Homeowner Association. "Mr. Drake," he began, flipping open a folder, "the association has filed a formal complaint against you for defamation and harassment. You're being summoned to a mediation hearing next week." I stared at him, incredulous. "Defamation? Harassment? All I did was present facts at a public meeting." Hayes' expression didn't waver. "The Homeowner Association contends that your statements were baseless and damaging to Mrs. Reed's reputation." "Let me guess," I said, crossing my arms. "Karen put you up to this?" Hayes didn't answer directly. "I strongly advise you to resolve this matter amicably, Mr. Drake. Otherwise, the Homeowner Association is prepared to escalate the issue." As he walked away, I felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't about defamation, it was about intimidation. Karen was using the Homeowner Association's resources as a weapon to silence me. The second strike was more personal. The next day, I found a notice taped to my front door. It claimed that my lawn was in violation of Homeowner Association regulations due to excessive overgrowth and threatened a fine if I didn't address it immediately. The irony was laughable. I had mowed my lawn just 2 days earlier. When I called the Homeowner Association office to dispute the notice, the receptionist's cheerful tone only fueled my anger. "Oh, Mr. Drake, we've had several complaints about your property," she said. "It's our duty to ensure that all homeowners adhere to community standards." I knew exactly who those complaints had come from. That evening, James came over to help me strategize. Over beers in my kitchen, we reviewed the mediation notice and brainstormed ways to counter Karen's attacks. "She's trying to bury you in bureaucracy," James said. "Typical tactic. She wants to wear you down until you give up." "She's underestimating how stubborn I can be," I replied. James chuckled. "Good. You'll need that stubbornness because this isn't going to end anytime soon." The mediation hearing was held in a sterile conference room at the Homeowner Association's office. Karen was there, flanked by Carl Hayes and another board member. I'd come prepared, armed with copies of James's analysis of the inspection report and documentation of Karen's questionable history. The mediator, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, opened the session by stating the ground rules. "This is not a courtroom," he said. "Our goal is to reach a mutually agreeable resolution. Let's begin with the Homeowner Association's complaint." Hayes launched into a rehearsed speech about how my accusations had damaged Karen's reputation and undermined the Homeowner Association's authority. When it was my turn to respond, I laid out my evidence methodically, pointing out the flaws in the inspection report and highlighting Karen's history of unethical behavior. Karen's face remained stoic, but I could see the tension in her clenched jaw. When the mediator asked if she'd like to respond, she leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Drake has a vivid imagination," she said. "These allegations are baseless and defamatory. I've dedicated countless hours to improving this community, and it's disheartening to see my efforts undermined by one individual." "Improving the community," I shot back. "You mean exploiting it for your own gain?" The mediator raised his hand, silencing us. "Let's keep this civil," he said. By the end of the hearing, no resolution had been reached. The mediator suggested another session, but I knew it was pointless. Karen wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted to crush me. As I left the building, I noticed a black SUV idling near the curb. The driver's window was rolled down just enough for me to see Karen's face. She smirked, giving me a little wave as the SUV pulled away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen smirk. She was tightening her grip, escalating her attacks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all building towards something bigger. The bridge was just the beginning. If Karen wanted a war, she'd get one. But I wasn't going to fight on her terms. I had to find a way to expose her for what she truly was, before she destroyed everything I'd worked for. The days following the mediation hearing were a whirlwind of petty notices, mysterious phone calls, and a growing tension that blanketed the neighborhood. Karen's smirk at the end of the meeting had been a promise, not a gesture. She wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to ruin me. One morning, I awoke to find my driveway blocked by a freshly installed no parking sign. It was absurd. The sign was bolted into the ground directly in front of my property. A quick call to the city confirmed what I already suspected. The Homeowner Association had filed a request to designate the area as a fire lane. It was yet another move in Karen's campaign to make my life impossible. The final straw came when I found a letter taped to my front door. It was an eviction notice, an absurd, baseless document claiming that I had violated the neighborhood's bylaws so egregiously that my residency was no longer compatible with community standards. It was signed, of course, by Karen herself. That evening, James came over with a folder of documents that would finally tip the scales in my favor. "You're not going to believe this," he said, spreading the papers across my kitchen table. "I've been digging into the Homeowner Association's financials. There are payments to a contractor named Horizon Development. Big payments. Guess who owns Horizon?" I didn't need to guess. "Karen." James nodded. "She's been funneling homeowner association funds into her own company under the guise of community improvement projects. Your bridge? That's just the first step. She's planning to rezone part of this area to sell it off for development. It's all here." I stared at the documents, a mix of fury and determination surging through me. "This is the proof we need," I said. "We're going to bring her down." The next homeowner association meeting was unlike any other. Word had spread that I had uncovered something big, and the room was packed. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual air of smug confidence in place, but I noticed the subtle tension in her posture. When the meeting opened to homeowner comments, I stood up. "Before we get into tonight's agenda," I began, holding up the folder of evidence, "I think it's time we address the real reason behind the Homeowner Association's recent actions." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Drake, if this is another baseless attack—" "It's not baseless," I interrupted. "I have proof that Karen has been using homeowner association funds to enrich herself through a company she owns." The room erupted in murmurs. I handed out copies of the documents to the neighbors and board members, detailing the payments made to Horizon Development and Karen's connection to the company. Karen's composure cracked. "This is a gross misrepresentation," she snapped. "These payments were for legitimate community projects." "Like demolishing my bridge," I countered, "which just so happens to be on the land you're trying to rezone for development." A wave of unease swept through the room. Some neighbors began to voice their doubts, questioning other recent homeowner association projects. Karen tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. Her allies on the board faltered under the scrutiny, and for the first time she looked truly cornered. That night, as I returned home, I felt a glimmer of hope. The evidence was out, and the neighborhood was beginning to see Karen for what she truly was. But as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something odd. The lights in my house were on, though I distinctly remembered turning them off before leaving. Cautiously, I approached the front door. It was unlocked. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, scanning the living room. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but then I saw it. The folder of documents James had left with me, the originals, was gone. Panic set in. I checked every room, but there was no sign of forced entry and no trace of the folder. Whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were looking for. I called James, my voice shaking. "Someone broke into my house. The documents are gone." "Are you sure?" he asked, alarmed. "Positive. They didn't take anything else." There was a pause on the line. "Karen," he said finally, "she's desperate. You need to be careful, Mike. If she's willing to go this far, there's no telling what she'll do next." The break-in was a wake-up call. Karen wasn't just fighting to save her reputation. She was fighting to protect a lucrative scheme. But she had underestimated me. The originals might be gone, but James still had copies. And this time, we were going straight to the authorities. Early the next morning, I met with a local investigator, Detective Laura Grant. She listened intently as I laid out the evidence and recounted the harassment I'd endured. By the end of the meeting, she assured me that an investigation would be launched immediately. "People like Karen always leave a trail," Detective Grant said. "We'll find it." As I drove home, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Karen's empire was crumbling, and she knew it. The question was, how far would she go to stop me? The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. The days following the break-in were tense. I doubled down on securing my home, installing cameras and changing locks. But the unease lingered. Karen had made her move, and I had no doubt she was planning her next one. Still, I had an ace up my sleeve. Detective Laura Grant was on the case, and with her involvement, the tide was turning in my favor. The first breakthrough came a week later. Laura called me to say her team had uncovered financial discrepancies in the homeowner association's accounts. Karen's connection to Horizon Development was undeniable, and further digging revealed shell companies tied to her name. It was the smoking gun we needed. This is enough to launch a full-scale investigation, Laura said. But be prepared, Mike. Karen won't go down without a fight. She wasn't wrong. That evening, I received a call from an unknown number. A cold, clipped voice on the other end said, "Drop this, or you'll regret it." Then the line went dead. I'd expected intimidation, but it only steeled my resolve. If Karen thought she could scare me into submission, she'd picked the wrong man. The next homeowner association meeting was packed. Word of the investigation had spread, and tensions were at an all-time high. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual composure replaced with a thinly veiled nervousness. She tried to maintain control, calling the meeting to order with a shaky gavel. As the agenda unfolded, I waited for my moment. When the floor opened for homeowner comments, I stood, holding a folder of Laura's preliminary findings. "I have some updates regarding the Homeowner Association's recent actions," I began. Karen's face hardened. "Mr. Drake, this is highly inappropriate. The Homeowner Association's finances are not up for public discussion." "Actually, they are," I said, stepping forward. "Especially when those finances have been misused to line the pockets of certain individuals." A murmur rippled through the room as I distributed copies of the evidence. Payments to Horizon Development, shell companies linked to Karen, and falsified reports about my bridge were all laid bare. Karen's allies on the board squirmed in their seats, while the rest of the homeowners leaned forward, hanging on every word. "This is outrageous," Karen spat, rising to her feet. "These so-called findings are nothing more than a smear campaign orchestrated by a disgruntled homeowner." "The findings come from law enforcement," I countered. "Detective Laura Grant has already launched a formal investigation, and if anyone here doubts their validity, you're welcome to see the evidence for yourselves." The room erupted. Neighbors who had once supported Karen now questioned her integrity, demanding answers. Her grip on the homeowner association was slipping, and she knew it. Later that night, I received a call from Laura. "We've got enough to charge Karen with embezzlement and fraud," she said. "We're moving forward with an arrest. But be careful, Mike. She might try something desperate." Her warning proved prophetic. The next morning, I awoke to find my car vandalized, its tires slashed and windows shattered. A crude message was spray-painted across the hood. "Stay silent." I reported the incident to Laura, who promised to increase patrols in the area, but the attack only fueled my determination. Karen was unraveling, and her desperation was proof that the walls were closing in. The climax came a week later. I was home when a black SUV pulled into my driveway. Two men in suits stepped out, followed by Karen. They didn't bother knocking. They simply walked into my yard as if they owned the place. "Mike," Karen said, her voice deceptively calm, "let's settle this once and for all." I crossed my arms, blocking the path to my door. "There's nothing to settle. You've been exposed, Karen. It's over." Her mask of composure slipped. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I said, my voice steady. "A corrupt opportunist who finally got caught." One of the men stepped forward, but before he could say anything, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars swarmed the driveway, and officers poured out, weapons drawn. "Karen Reed," Laura announced, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and harassment." Karen's face turned pale. She sputtered protests as the officers cuffed her and led her to a waiting car. Her associates quickly followed, their attempts to flee thwarted by the officers on the scene. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. Karen's resignation was immediate, and a new board was elected, one committed to transparency and fairness. The bridge, once a symbol of my battle, was restored with funds reclaimed from Karen's ill-gotten gains. Standing on that bridge, I felt a wave of relief and pride. The fight had been long and brutal, but justice had prevailed. Karen's reign of terror was over, and the neighborhood could finally heal. As I looked out over the water, I thought of my father and the legacy he'd left me. I'd protected that legacy, not just for myself, but for everyone who called this place home. And that made every struggle worth it.